Are you able to see my screen? Yes, sir. Perfect. Right. All of you, welcome to Ashok IT. As part of today's session, we are going to understand Spring MVC architecture. How many components will be available in Spring MVC architecture and how the request will be processed in our Spring MVC based application. We are going to understand all those details. All right, let's get started. In the last session, we understood what is MVC. We understood what is MVC and we understood what is Spring MVC. What are the advantages of Spring MVC? What are the advantages of Spring MVC? These concepts we covered in our last session, right? MVC. MVC stands for Model View Controller. It is an universal design pattern to develop our applications with loosely coupling, right? Then what is Spring MVC? Spring MVC is a module available in Spring Framework, which is used to develop both web-based and distributed applications. So by using Spring MVC, we can develop a web application for C2B communication, and we can develop a distributed application also for B2B communications, right? Now, can I develop a standalone application by using Spring MVC module? No. Spring MVC meant for only web applications development. And what are the advantages of going for Spring MVC? So here, as we discussed, the roles of the components are clearly defined and clearly separated in the Spring MVC. And Spring MVC providing form binding object support. So we no need to write the logic to capture form data like request.get parameter. Form binding support is available in the Spring MVC. And Spring MVC simplified our applications development by providing some configurations for us, and which is intended to improve productivity of the developer. And Spring MVC supporting for I18 and applications development also. These concepts we discussed in our last session, right? Now, today's session. So today we are going to mainly concentrate on Spring MVC components. Spring MVC components. What are the components available in Spring MVC? Spring MVC architecture. Spring MVC architecture, and we will understand request execution flow. Request execution flow in Spring MVC application. Request execution flow in Spring MVC application. The agenda for the today's session: what are the components are available in the Spring MVC module, and what is the architecture of our Spring MVC, and if I develop an application by using Spring MVC, how the request will be processed by our application. Those details also we are going to understand as part of today's session. So I hope agenda is clear for everyone. Already we completed these concepts in the last two sessions, and today we are going to understand these concepts. All right, let's begin. Spring MVC components first. Spring MVC components. In our Spring MVC, we have several components. First one is front controller. When we are talking about a Spring MVC, we need to talk about two things. One is MVC design pattern. Second one is front controller design pattern. Spring MVC module is developed based on two design patterns. One is MVC design pattern and second one is front controller design pattern. In the Spring MVC module, dispatcher servlet we are going to use as a front controller, right? Now, second one is handler mapper. Second component we need to understand, handler mapper. Third component is controller. Third component, controller. Fourth component, model and view. Fourth component is model and view, right? Next, Fifth component is view resolver. Fifth component view resolver, and sixth component view. Sixth component is view. So in order to understand Spring MVC module, or in order to work with Spring MVC module in our applications, you need to understand these components first. Without knowing these components, you cannot say that you know Spring MVC. If you want to work with Spring MVC, or if you want to learn the Spring MVC, first you need to understand these components. Then only you are eligible to develop an application by using Spring MVC module. Right. So now tell me, what is the purpose of Spring MVC first? Why Spring Framework provided the Spring MVC module? There are several modules available in the framework. What is the purpose of this particular module? Could you please confirm? What is the purpose of this Spring MVC module? I need answers. Respond. What is the purpose of this particular module? Yes, this module is used to develop web applications as well as distributed applications. So if you want to develop a web application, then you can choose Spring MVC. If you want to develop a distributed application like a web service application, then also you can choose Spring MVC. It is meant for Spring MVC meant for developing two types of applications, web applications as well as distributed applications. Web applications and distributed applications, right? As part of this Spring MVC, front controller is available, handler mapper is available, controller is available, model and view is available, view resolver is available, and view component is available, right? Now, first point, Spring MVC module is used to develop below types of applications. Below types of applications. First of all, Spring MVC is one module available in Spring Framework. Spring MVC module available in Spring Framework. In Spring Framework. In first version of the Spring, in Spring 1.x version, we have Spring MVC module and Spring Web MVC module. MVC module JEE and Spring Web MVC module, two modules are available in 1.x version of the Spring. Spring JEE and Spring MVC modules are available in the 1.x version of the Spring, but when it comes to Spring 2.x version, in Spring 2.x version, web module and MVC module are combined and released Spring Web MVC module. In the 1.x version, there are two different modules available, but in the Spring 2.x version, those two modules are combined and they release Spring Web MVC module. So if you see Spring Framework diagram also, 1.x version contains 7 modules, but in the 2.x version, 6 modules will be available. It doesn't mean they removed one module. They combined, they merged 2 modules into one module, that is called Spring Web MVC module. Right. Now, what is the purpose of this Spring Web MVC module? Why this module is added as part of Spring Framework? Which is used to, this module is responsible to develop as part of our applications development. If you are developing a web application, then we can use Spring MVC module. So I want to develop a REST API. Nowadays, REST is trending in the market. I want to develop a REST API, then how can I do it? By using Spring Framework. For that, we can use the Spring MVC module. Spring MVC supports for web application development as well as REST API development also. Web application development plus REST API development also we can do by using Spring MVC module or Spring Web MVC module. This Spring Web MVC module is developed based on 2 design patterns. This Spring Web MVC module is developed based on 2 design patterns. So it is using 2 design patterns. So what are those 2 design patterns? First one is MVC design pattern. And the second one is front controller design pattern. front controller design pattern. So we will use several design patterns as part of application development, right? Like singleton design pattern and factory design pattern, right? Builder design pattern, right? Like that. We are going to use several design patterns for the best solutions in our application. So similarly, MVC is one design pattern which is used to develop applications with loosely coupling. That MVC is not specific to Java, that is a universal design pattern. Any programming language we can use to develop an application by using MVC design pattern. It is an architectural pattern. Similarly, front controller design pattern. We'll talk about what is that front controller now. Spring MVC is using these two design patterns. One is MVC design pattern and the second one is front controller design pattern. And as part of the Spring Web MVC module, these are the components we are going to see. So to work with Spring MVC, to develop applications by using Spring MVC module, if you want to develop a web application or if you want to develop a REST API, we need to understand these components first. We need to understand these components first. So I hope all of you clear with what we are trying to understand. First of all, Spring MVC module available in Spring Framework. Spring MVC module is part of the Spring Framework, we can say. Spring MVC module is part of Spring Framework. Spring Framework is developed in modular fashion. In that, Spring MVC is one module. We will also call it as Spring Web MVC module. Why we are calling it as Web MVC, which is used to develop web applications. In the Spring 1.x version, two different modules are there, but in the Spring 2.x version, those two modules are merged and released as one module, which is called Spring Web MVC module. We can develop two types of applications we can develop by using Spring Web MVC module. What are those applications? One is web applications and second one is distributed applications. Also we can develop by using Spring Web MVC module. Web applications and distributed applications also we can develop by using Spring Web MVC. The Spring Web MVC module is developed based on two design patterns. One is called MVC design pattern and second one is called front controller design pattern. One is MVC design pattern and second one is front controller design pattern. All of you clear with all these points as of now? What is Spring Web MVC? What we can do by using Spring Web MVC? What are the design patterns it is using? All of you clear with these all these concepts? Please confirm. All of you clear with this or not? Right. Guys, please be active. Now, in the Spring MVC, as we have seen, several components are available. Now, what is the purpose of those components? Let us try to understand. So first one, front controller. Front controller is responsible. Front controller is responsible to perform pre-processing and post-processing of a request, of incoming request. Now, for a web application, end users will send a request. So you will click on a button. One request will go to the server. When the request received by the server, we need to perform some pre-processing logic, something like capturing the data from the form. That can be called as a pre-processing. Whenever we send a request to the server will receive that request. At the server side, some pre-processing should happen, and once the request processing is completed, that response should send back to the client in a client understandable format. That is called post-processing of a request. So in a web application, for every request, some pre-processing and some post-processing is required. So who will perform that pre-processing and post-processing? So are we going to perform pre-processing and post-processing logic in every controller? No. That's where front controller comes into picture. For all incoming requests, front controller is responsible to perform pre-processing and post-processing of incoming request. Pre-processing example, for example, For example, capturing form data. Capturing form data, for example, capturing form data, we can consider as a pre-processing of request. As pre-processing of request. Right. In our application, several forms will be available. I don't want to write the logic to capture form data by writing request.get parameter. So as we discussed in the advantages of the Spring MVC, form binding is available. If you submit the form data will be given to you in the form of object. That can be called as a pre-processing logic. Right. Now, for example, sending response back to client in client understandable format can be called as post processing of a request. Now, what is the duty of the front controller in the Spring MVC? Front controller is going to execute before our controller. So actually in our web applications, controllers will be available which are used to handle the request. But before controller will process the request, front controller is going to receive the request. What is the purpose of that front controller? It is responsible to perform pre-processing and post-processing of incoming request. So what is pre-processing? Capturing the data from the form, we can call as pre-processing of a request. What is post-processing? Once request processing is completed, sending response back to the client in the client understandable format can be called as post-processing of a request. Now, in our Spring MVC based web application also, pre-processing is required, post-processing is required for a request. Pre-processing of the request, post-processing of the request. Who will perform the pre-processing and post-processing of a request? In the Spring Web MVC module, if you use that Web MVC module to develop a web application, then dispatcher servlet will work as a front controller. So in Spring Web MVC based application, in Spring Web MVC based application, we will use dispatcher servlet as a front controller. In Spring Web MVC based application, we will use dispatcher servlet as a front controller. So what is this dispatcher servlet? Dispatcher servlet is a predefined servlet provided by Spring MVC. Dispatcher servlet is a predefined servlet provided by Spring MVC module. It is a predefined servlet provided by Spring MVC module. People will call it as a framework servlet. Dispatcher servlet will be called as Spring Framework Servlet. It is called as Spring Framework Servlet because it is a predefined servlet class that is provided by our Spring MVC module. Now, go through these points once. What is front controller? Front controller is responsible to perform pre-processing and post-processing of incoming request. So what is the example for pre-processing and post-processing? So in your daily life, you will use several web applications, right? There you will fill several forms. So at the server side, they need to capture your form data. So whenever you send a request, they need to capture your form data. Right now, so capturing the form data for you of your request can be called as a pre-processing. Right. After capturing the data, they will do some business operation with your data. Then they will send you a response. So once your request processing is completed, response will come to you. So how the response is coming to you? In your understandable format, right? So sending response back to the client in the understandable format can be called as a post-processing. Of a request, right? Now, so who is responsible to perform this pre-processing and post-processing of a request in Spring MVC application? Who is responsible for that? Come on guys, please respond. Who is responsible to perform pre-processing and post-processing of a request in Spring MVC application? That is dispatcher servlet. Dispatcher servlet is going to act as a front controller in Spring MVC. In the Spring Web MVC, dispatcher servlet is going to act as a front controller. What is the dispatcher servlet? Dispatcher servlet is a predefined servlet class provided by Spring MVC module. As it is a predefined, it is provided by the framework. This is called as a framework servlet. Dispatcher servlet will be called as a Spring framework servlet. Will be called as Spring framework servlet. I hope you got some basic idea what is this dispatcher servlet, what is this front controller. So just theoretically we are trying to understand as part of this architecture explanation. So in the tomorrow session we are going to work on this practically. We are going to develop Spring Web MVC based application using Spring Boot. Then you will understand what is this dispatcher servlet and what actually it is doing in our application. So first we are trying to understand what it is. So in the tomorrow session we will see how to use it and what it is doing internally. Those internals also we are going to talk about. Fine. Now, so diagrammatically, let me represent. This is my dispatcher servlet. Let me represent this as my dispatcher servlet. Dispatcher servlet can be called as a front controller. So let me directly write the name of the servlet, dispatcher servlet. This dispatcher servlet is a predefined servlet class provided by Spring Framework. That is the reason it is called as framework servlet. It is called as framework servlet. Fine. Now, whenever end user sends a request, that request will be received by dispatcher servlet. This can be called as one HTTP request. So whenever you perform some operation in the web application, then HTTP request will be generated and will send to the server. At the server side, who is going to receive our request? Front controller is going to receive our request. Who is front controller in our Spring Web MVC application? Dispatcher servlet is working as a front controller. Dispatcher servlet is going to work as a front controller. Fine. Perfect. Dispatcher servlet received that request. Now, dispatcher servlet is going to process our request, or dispatcher servlet will not process our request. Suppose I have clicked on a login button by entering username and password. So is that dispatcher servlet will verify my credentials are valid or not, or dispatcher servlet cannot verify my credentials are valid or not? Come on, please respond. Dispatcher servlet will verify my credentials are valid or not, or dispatcher servlet cannot verify my credentials are valid or not? Come on. Dispatcher servlet cannot verify that. Dispatcher servlet not meant for executing our business logic. Dispatcher servlet not meant for executing our business logic. Dispatcher servlet meant for only pre-processing and post-processing of your request. It is meant for only pre-processing and post-processing of a request. Dispatcher servlet doesn't mean for processing our request. Dispatcher servlet doesn't mean for executing business logic for our application. It is just a front controller which will perform pre-processing and post-processing of a request. It will just perform pre-processing and post-processing of a request. Then, who is responsible to process our request? In the Spring MVC based application, who is our request handler? Who is responsible to handle our request? That's where controllers comes into picture. So to handle a request, controllers comes into picture. Controllers comes into picture. But in our application, one controller will be available or several controllers will be available. Can you develop your whole project by using only one controller, or you will develop multiple controllers in your project? I need your answers. Be active. So are you going to develop only one controller, or you are going to develop several controllers in your application? We don't develop our project by using only one controller. Our project will be developed by using multiple controllers. Multiple controller classes will be available in our application. Multiple controllers will be available in our application. Right. Now, whenever you clicked on a login button, which controller has to execute? There are 1000 controllers in the application. There are 1000 controllers available in the application. Now, which controller is responsible to process this request? Which controller is responsible to process this request? Will end user tells that controller has to execute my request? No, end user don't know. End user will just click on a button. That request is coming to dispatcher servlet. There are several controllers available in the project. There are 1000 controllers are available in the project. which controller is responsible to handle our request, that should be identified by handler mapper. So there is a component called handler mapper. There is a component called handler mapper. Handler mapper. Handler mapper is a predefined class available in Handler mapper is a predefined class available in Spring MVC. Handler mapper is a predefined class available in Spring MVC. Spring MVC. What is the duty of the handler mapper? Handler mapper is responsible to identify request handler. Handler mapper is responsible to identify request handler. Request handler means controller. Responsible to identify request handler. Request handler means controller. Request handler means the controller which is handling the request. The program which is handling your request is called as a request handler. The program which is handling incoming request is called as request handler. Controllers will be called as request handlers. In the web application, controllers will be called as request handlers. So who is going to handle our request? When end user send a request, who will handle that request? Controller is going to handle the request. That's why controller is called as a request handler. In our application, several controllers will be available. So end user, somebody will click on a login button, somebody will click on a forgot password hyperlink, somebody will click on register button. Right. So several types of requests will come. To handle those requests, several controllers will be available. Now here the question is, which request should be handled by which controller? That will be identified by handler mapper. Handler mapper is responsible to identify the request handler for the incoming request. Are you able to follow this? Right. Now, so here handler mapper component will be available. Here handler mapper component will be available. Now, whenever the request comes to the dispatcher servlet, that dispatcher servlet should identify which controller should process this request. That's why this dispatcher servlet will send request details to the handler mapper. Dispatcher servlet will send request details to handler mapper. So request URL patterns will be available, right? So that URL pattern will be sent to handler mapper. Now, handler mapper will identify the request handler which is responsible to process this request. Request handler will be identified by handler mapper. In your application, it is going to scan which controller method is binded to this URL pattern. That will be identified by handler mapper. Now tell me, what is the duty of the handler mapper in our Spring MVC? Handler mapper is responsible to identify request handler. It is responsible to identify which controller should process this request. That will be identified by handler mapper. All right. Now observe once again. So request comes to our application, Spring MVC based application. Who will receive that request now? Dispatcher servlet. Because dispatcher servlet we are going to configure as a front controller. What is the meaning of front controller? It is responsible to perform pre-processing and post-processing of a request. It is responsible to perform pre-processing and post-processing of a request. Right. Whenever request comes, dispatcher servlet will read that request, will take some data from the request, that is a URL pattern. It will give that URL pattern to handler mapper. Now handler mapper, what is this handler mapper? Handler mapper is a predefined class available in the Spring MVC. It is responsible to identify request handler. What is request handler? The program which is handling incoming request is called as request handler. controllers will be called as request handlers. Controllers will be called as request handlers. Handler mapper will identify request handler and returns handler details to dispatcher servlet. Returns handler details to dispatcher servlet. So dispatcher servlet will give request information to the handler mapper. Then handler mapper will identify who is going to process this request, which program is going to process that request. It will identify that controller. It will provide that controller details back to the dispatcher servlet. It will provide that handler mapper will provide that request handler details back to dispatcher servlet. Are you able to follow me? Dispatcher servlet is a front controller. It is responsible to perform pre-processing and post-processing of a request. Whenever request comes, that is receiving by our dispatcher servlet in the Spring MVC application. Now, dispatcher servlet cannot process business logic. Dispatch servlet is a predefined class. It doesn't contain the business logic. It is not meant for processing our request. What it will do? Dispatcher servlet will talk to handler mapper. Hey handler mapper, I got this request. Do you know who can process this request? Like that, dispatcher servlet will communicate with the handler mapper. Handler mapper will identify who is responsible. That means which controller is responsible to process. Then that controller details will be sent back to the dispatcher servlet. Finally, dispatcher servlet got which controller is responsible, which is the request handler for this request. The details will be sent by handler mapper to dispatcher servlet. Then what the dispatcher servlet has to do? Dispatcher servlet has to communicate with that controller. Dispatcher servlet should tell to that controller, hey controller, I got this request, please process that. That is how dispatcher servlet should talk to controller. So what is controller? What is controller? Right? In the web applications, we are going to develop controllers. Controller. So what is controller? Controller is a program which is responsible to handle the request. Controller is a program which is responsible to handle request. Controller is responsible to handle request. That means request processing will be done by the controller. Request processing will be done by the controller. So what is controller? Controller is a program which is responsible to handle request. So in Spring MVC, using Spring MVC module, we can create our own controllers. Using Spring MVC module, we can create our own controllers. So in Spring MVC, some predefined controller classes are available. In Spring MVC, some predefined controller classes are available. Controller classes are available like below. In Spring MVC, some predefined controller classes are available like below. What are those? One is simple form controller, abstract command controller, abstract command controller, multi-action controller, etc. Multi-action controller, etc. Like that. In the Spring Web MVC module, they provided some predefined controller classes for us. Using these controller classes, we can create our own controller. But unfortunately, these are outdated. Nobody will use these predefined controller classes to develop our controller because they are outdated. So in the industry, no Spring developer is using these predefined controllers to develop our controllers. The reason is from Spring 3.0, at controller annotation is introduced. That is used to develop our own controllers using annotation approach, either in the 2.5 or 3.0. I forgot the version number exactly. So I think from 3.0, right? So we got at controller annotation. We can create our own controller using at controller annotation. We can create user-defined controller. Using at controller annotation. At controller annotation. At control annotation. We are not going to use these predefined controllers. We are going to use at controller annotation to create our own controller. Right. Now, what is a controller in the web application? Controller is a program which is responsible to handle request. Controller is a program which is responsible to handle request. Using Spring MVC module, we can create our own controllers. Using Spring MVC module, we can create our own controllers. How many ways we can create? There are two ways. We can create a controller in two ways. One is by extending predefined controller classes. Second one is by using at controller annotation. There are two approaches available to create user-defined controller in Spring MVC application. First approach, by extending the properties from predefined controller classes, that is outdated. Second approach, using at control annotation, which is using in the industry and it is recommended. It is recommended, right? Now, what is the duty of the controller? Take the request, process the request, send back. Take the incoming request, process that request, send response back to dispatcher servlet. Right. Now, so here dispatcher servlet is going to talk to controller. Dispatcher servlet is going to talk to controller. Why? It has to process. Controller is responsible to process that request. Controller is responsible to process that request. Right. Who identified which controller should process this request? Handler mapper identified which controller should process this request. Now, with that, dispatcher servlet will give request data to the controller. Dispatcher servlet will give request data to controller. Suppose you are sending a form data or you are sending some path parameters, you are sending some query parameters. Those details will be given to controller. Now, controller will process that request. Controller will process that request. Controller will send data back to the dispatcher servlet. Controller will send data back to the dispatcher servlet. That data is called as model and view. That data is called as a model and view. Controllers will send response back to the dispatcher servlet in the form of model and view. It is going to send the data back to the dispatch servlet in the form of MAV. This is called as a model and view object. This model and view object contains the response details. It contains the response details, right? Because dispatcher servlet got the request. It gave the request data to the handler mapper. Handler mapper identified who is responsible to process. Handler mapper identified who is responsible to process. Now, it identified there is a controller called user controller. User controller is responsible to handle this request. Then dispatcher servlet will give that request to the controller with some inputs. Some data will be given to that controller. Then what this controller will do? Controller will process that request. Controller can talk to service layer. Controller will talk to service. Service will talk to DAO. DAO will talk to database. Those components will be available. At the end, controller will return the response back to the dispatcher servlet in the form of model and view object, MAV. Model and view object. What is this model and view object? What is this model and view object? Come on, anybody can answer. What is model and view object? Once request processing is completed, controller will return model and view object to dispatcher servlet. Model and view object to dispatcher servlet. Model and view object is a predefined class. Model and view is a predefined class available in Spring MVC module. So once your request is processed by the controller, that controller will return some data back to the dispatcher servlet in the form of one object. Controller is returning some data back to the dispatch servlet in the form of one object. What is that object? That object belongs to model and view class. Model and view class, right? What is this model and view? Model and view will represent response data and response page. In model and view class, model represents data and view represents logical view name. View represents logical view name. What does that mean? Model holds data. Which data? Response data. Which data we need to send? Holds data. View. It represents logical view file name. Logical view file name, where the data should be displayed. In our application, several view components are available. In our application, several view components are available. Whenever client send that request, in which page that response should be displayed. In which page that response should be displayed, that will be decided by view. What data should be displayed as a response, that will be there in the model. So once a controller processes that request, controller will send the data back to the dispatcher servlet in the form of model and view object. So controller will send the data back to the dispatcher servlet in the form of model and view object. Model, we are going to set the data to the model. For the view, we will set logical file name. We'll set logical file name, view file name, index or dashboard or reports, something like that. Just we'll set a file name, but not the extension, because controllers don't know which presentation technology we are using. Controllers don't know which presentation technology we are using, because Spring MVC supports for multiple presentation technologies. Not only JSP, we can use a different presentation technology also. Controllers are independent on the presentation technology. Controller is only responsible to send what is the data should be displayed, in which file that data should be displayed. That file may be a JSP, that file may be a theme leaf, that file may be a velocity, that file may be a free marker. N number of presentation technologies are available. We can use any one of the presentation technology in our application, but controller doesn't know which presentation technology we are using. Controller will tell only this is the data, this is the file name. That's it. It doesn't know what is the file extension. It doesn't know whether that file is a JSP or it doesn't know whether that file is a time leaf. It will just tell this is the name of the file. This is the data that you have to display. To whom it is giving that data? Controller is giving that data back to the dispatcher servlet in the form of model and view object. Model holds the data, view holds the file name. So controller will set the data to the model and view object. Model and view is a predefined class. We can set the data to that, we can set the file name to that, just by calling the methods provided by that class. Then controller will return that model and view object to dispatcher servlet. I hope you are clear with this. What controller will do? Controller will receive a request from the dispatcher servlet. Controller will process that request. Controller will send the data in the form of model and view object to the dispatcher servlet, because the request is not directly coming to the controller. Request is coming to dispatcher servlet. Dispatcher servlet is talking to handler mapper. Handler mapper identifying which controller should process. Then dispatcher servlet will go and call that controller. Then controller will process that request. Then controller will send the data back to the dispatcher servlet in the form of model and view object. In the form of model and view object, that means what data should be displayed as a response and in which page that data should be displayed. Those details will be given in the form of model and view object by the controller to the dispatcher servlet. Are you able to follow me? What is this model and view object? Any questions, anybody? Right. Next one. Next one, view resolver. Next one is view resolver. What is this view resolver? What is this view resolver and what is the role of the view resolver in our Spring MVC? Right. Now, controller returned model and view object. Model means holding the data. What data should be displayed as a response that we will be setting in the model. View means it is a logical file name. View means it is a logical file name. Now, dispatcher servlet should identify where those view files are available. So because controller told that, hey dispatcher, this is the data, this is the file name. You do whatever you want. Then what is the duty of the dispatcher servlet? Dispatcher servlet should identify where that view file is available. Controller told just login. Whether login is a JSP or login is a HTML or login is a time leaf or login is a velocity or login is a free marker. What is that? What is the presentation technology and where that file is available? That doesn't know to dispatcher servlet. Controller just told. Controller just told. Now, controller just told this is the data and this is the file name. But where is that file? Where is that file available in the project? In which folder that file is available? And what is that file extension? Those details don't know to our dispatcher servlet. So that is the reason dispatcher servlet will talk to one more component called view resolver. Dispatcher servlet will talk to one more component called view resolver. So in Spring MVC, we have multiple view resolver classes. In Spring MVC, we have multiple view resolver classes. Example, internal resource view resolver, internal resource view resolver, URL based view resolver, XML view resolver, etc. Like that. In our Spring MVC module, there are several predefined view resolver classes are available. Those are these view resolvers are responsible to identify view files. These are responsible to identify view files, location and extension. Where that file is available and what is the technology used to develop that file. Is it a JSP or is it a time leaf? So that will be identified by our view resolvers, right? So what is the duty of the view resolver in the Spring MVC? View resolvers are responsible to identify the location of the view components, are responsible to identify view files location and view file extension, right? Now, whatever the view name that is given by the dispatcher servlet, that view name will be given to view resolver in Spring MVC. Who will give that? Dispatcher servlet will give that view location to view resolver. Dispatcher servlet will give that view location to view resolver. Who will give view name to dispatcher servlet? View name given by controller. Then dispatcher servlet will give that view name to view resolver. It will give that view name to view resolver, right? Then view resolver will identify where the view components are available and what is the extension of the view component. Then it will send that location of the view component to dispatcher servlet. It will send the location of the view component and the extension of the view component to dispatcher servlet. Right? So view resolver will identify the location of the view files and the extension of the view file, and it will send that data back to dispatcher servlet. Now with this, dispatcher servlet know what is the data should be displayed in the view. and in which view component that data should be displayed also known to the dispatcher servlet. Now it knows the data, now it knows the file also. Now what is the next thing? It has to render that data on that file. It has to display the data on the file. For that, dispatcher servlet will talk to one more component called view component. Dispatcher servlet will talk to one more component called view component. It will talk to one more component called view component. Now, what will be given to the view component? What will be given to the view component? Dispatcher servlet will give modal data and view file to the view component. Then it is going to render that modal data on that particular view. It is going to render that particular modal data on that particular view. So what data it has to display? Controller already told that. And where it has to display? Controller told that. Where is that file? View resolver told that. Now, finally, dispatcher servlet knows what is the data it has to display and where it has to display that data. Now, it will give that modal data and view file to the view component. Then view component will render that modal data on that particular file and will send to dispatcher servlet. Will send that data to the dispatcher servlet. Right. Let's write what is view component. What is view component? What is view component? View component is responsible to render modal data on the view file. It is responsible to render modal data on view component, on view file. On view file. Right. So data and file will be given to view component and it is going to render that particular data on that particular view file and will send back to dispatcher servlet. Now what the dispatcher servlet will do? It will do the post processing and it will send the response back to the end user. Whoever sent that request, for that person, it is going to send HTTP response. Whoever sent the request for that, now it is going to send HTTP response for that request. HTTP response. This is called Spring MVC architecture flow or Spring MVC request execution flow. So whenever we develop an application by using Spring MVC module, our request will be processed in this way. And these are the components that are going to involved in our request execution. Spring MVC architecture. Spring MVC architecture. Just go through this diagram once. We just understood architecture theoretically. Now practically we need to experiment on this by developing several applications. Guys, people who are watching in YouTube, please like our video. Perfect. Right. Now, let me give some numbering for this, how this request is going to get processed. Right. So first, end user will send a request that can be called as 1. End user will send a request that can be called as a 1. Now, who is receiving that request? The request is receiving by dispatcher servlet. Request is receiving by dispatcher servlet. Now, dispatcher servlet is talking to handler mapper. Then handler mapper sending the response back to dispatcher servlet. Sending the response back to dispatcher servlet. Then dispatcher servlet is talking to controller. Dispatcher servlet is talking to controller. And the controller is returning some data back to dispatcher servlet. Sending data back to dispatcher servlet. Then dispatcher servlet is talking to view resolver. View resolver sending some data back to dispatcher servlet. Then dispatcher servlet talking to view component. View component sending some data to dispatcher. Finally, dispatcher servlet sending some data back to end user. Dispatcher servlet sending them data back to end user. This is the numbering that we can understand. Right. First, who is going to receive the request in our Spring MVC application? Who is going to receive our request in the Spring MVC application? Our request will be received by dispatcher servlet. What is dispatcher servlet? Dispatcher servlet is a predefined servlet available in Spring MVC, which is responsible to perform pre-processing and post-processing of a request. It is responsible to perform pre-processing and post-processing of a request. Now, dispatcher servlet only meant for pre-processing and post-processing. It doesn't mean for executing the business logic. Right. Now, whenever that request comes, dispatcher servlet will take the request information and will give the data to the handler mapper. What is the handler mapper? It is a component in the Spring MVC. What is the duty of that? What is the role of that handler mapper? Handler mapper should identify which controller should process this request. Which controller is responsible to process that request. Now, after identifying this, handler mapper will send that controller information to the dispatcher servlet. If there is no controller found, it will send. There is no controller found, that information to the dispatcher servlet. If a controller is available to handle, then this handler mapper will send that controller name and controller method to the dispatcher servlet. Now, with the details given by the handler mapper, dispatcher servlet will go to that controller and will call that controller method. Dispatcher servlet will go to that controller and will call that controller method. Now, what is that controller? Controller is a predefined program. Which is responsible to handle the request. So request handling logic will be available in the controller. It is responsible to handle that request. Controller can talk to service can talk to DAO. That process will be available. Right. After processing, what controller will do? After processing this request, what controller is going to do? Controller will send response to the dispatcher servlet in the form of model and view object. Controller will send the response back to the dispatcher servlet in the form of model and view object. Now, what is that model and view? Model and view is a predefined class which is used to represent the data and which is used to represent the view file name. Model and view is a predefined class. We will set the data in the form of model and view object in the controller and we will return that data back to dispatcher servlet. Model means data, view means view component, presentation, UI component. Right. That data will be given to dispatcher servlet. After fifth step is completed, dispatcher servlet knows what data it has to display as a response and where it has to display. But it doesn't know where that particular file is available. For that, dispatcher servlet will give the view name to view resolver. What is view resolver? View resolver is also a predefined component in the dispatcher servlet. View resolver is also a predefined component available in the Spring MVC. View resolver is a predefined component available in the Spring MVC, which is used to resolve the view locations. Dispatcher servlet only knows name of the view, but it doesn't know where that view is available. It will be identified by view resolver. There are several view resolver classes are available. Out of those, one is internal resource view resolver, which is very famous view resolver. So we are going to use that internal resource view resolver to identify the location of the views. It is used to identify the location of the views. Location means in which folder that view file is available and what is the extension of that file. That details, those details will be identified by view resolver and will send those details to dispatcher servlet. Will send those details to dispatcher servlet. So sixth step, dispatcher servlet will give just a view name to the resolver. Seventh step, view resolver will identify the location, will send the location details to the dispatcher servlet. Fine. Once the seventh step is completed, finally our dispatcher servlet knows where is that view available. And at the fifth step, it knows what is the data. At the seventh step, it knows where that file is available to display the data. Now, the data and that file, it will give to view component. It will give to view component as a eighth step. Right? Data is available, file is available. Now, what is the step? It has to render that model data on this particular view file. It has to render that model data on that particular view file. That will be done by view component. After doing that, dispatcher servlet will send response, HTTP response back to the client who sent the request. So client has sent a request, right, for our application. That request is received by dispatcher servlet at the server side. Finally, once this is done, dispatcher servlet will send response back to the client. That is called post-processing. So pre-processing, post-processing is done by dispatcher servlet in the Spring MVC. That's why this dispatcher servlet is called as a predefined servlet and it is called as front controller. It is a predefined servlet and it is doing front controller action. Before our controller is going to execute, front controllers are going to execute for every request. So we will configure dispatcher servlet as a front controller in our Spring MVC based application to perform pre-processing and post-processing of a request. So now just understand these numbers and understand the execution flow. Whenever a request comes, what is happening step by step, you should be able to understand. Don't buttify anything, just understand the concept. What are the components available in the Spring MVC and what is the role of each component and in which order these components are going to execute, you need to understand. Tomorrow, if anybody asks you Spring MVC architecture in the interview, don't explain orally. Ask them to give the pen and paper, then write this diagram on the pen and paper, then explain. Once if you write this diagram on the pen and paper, then the person will ask you, okay boss, stop it, because you know what is Spring MVC. So if you start explaining orally, they don't understand that properly. That's the reason whenever somebody asks you this question, ask them to give the pen and paper, draw the diagram on the paper and start explaining that. So that is the best approach to get good impression. All of you able to understand what is Spring MVC architecture and what are the components available? Right. There are several handler mappers also available. Simple URL handler mapper, request mapping handler mapper, class name URL handler map, class name URL handler mapper, like that. There are several predefined handler mappers are available. From 3.0, request mapping handler mapper is the default handler mapper using by our Spring MVC application, using by our dispatcher servlet. Any questions, anybody? Any questions, anybody? Right. Now let us write request execution flow. request execution flow. So in which order the request is going to process by our Spring MVC. Request execution flow in Spring MVC application. Theoretically, we are understanding. In the tomorrow session, you will get full clarity when I develop the application and when I show you practical details, right? So today, just theoretically, we are understanding the architecture. So tomorrow, we are going to develop the application and we will see that, right? Fine. First, when request will be first, request, incoming HTTP request will be received by, incoming HTTP request will be received by dispatcher servlet. Will be received by dispatcher servlet. What is it? It is predefined servlet acting as a front controller. DS is a predefined servlet in Spring MVC, and it is acting as front controller to perform pre-processing and post-processing. What is the second step? Dispatcher servlet will send request information, requested URL to handler mapper. That is the second step. What is that? There are several handler mappers are available. Request mapping URL handler mapper is the default handler mapper from the 3.0. Right now, handler mapper will identify request handler which is responsible to handle this request, and request handler details to dispatcher servlet. So at the third step, if you look at the diagram, at the third step, what a handler mapper is doing? Handler mapper is sending request handler details to dispatcher servlet. So what is the first step? Understand. Always when I am writing a point, imagine with the diagram, compare with the diagram. First step, incoming request will be received by dispatcher servlet. Incoming request will be received by dispatcher servlet. The dispatcher servlet is a predefined servlet class in Spring MVC, and it is acting as front controller, right? What the dispatcher servlet will do when the request is received? Dispatcher servlet will take the request information, will send the request URL to the handler mapper. What is that handler mapper? Handler mapper will identify request handler which is responsible to handle this request, and it will send request handler details to dispatcher servlet. That means name of the class and name of the method. Which method is responsible to handle that request? That information will be sent back to dispatcher servlet. Now, what the dispatcher servlet will do at the fourth step? Dispatcher servlet will call respective controller method. Will call respective controller class method. Dispatcher servlet will call respective controller class method. Right. Now, what is the fifth step? Controller will process that request. Will send a response to the dispatcher servlet in the form of modal and view object. Controller method will handle or will process request and will send modal and view object to dispatcher servlet. Will send modal and view object to dispatcher servlet. So what is the duty of the controller? Controller is responsible to process that request. Once the request processing is completed, controller will send modal and view object to dispatcher servlet. Will send modal and view object to dispatcher servlet. Modal means data. View means logical file name. Logical file name is only name of the file without extension. That is the controller duty. So fifth step, controller send model and view object to dispatcher servlet. Fine. Now dispatcher servlet don't know where the view files are available. Dispatcher servlet don't know where the view files are available. Now what it will do? Dispatcher servlet has to identify the location. To identify the location, we are having a view resolver, right? So at the sixth step, dispatcher servlet will give the view name to the view resolver to resolve the location, right? Now at the sixth step, dispatcher servlet will send view name to view resolver. Dispatcher servlet will send view name to view resolver. Now, what that view resolver is going to do? What is the duty of the view resolver? What is the duty of the view resolver? View resolver will identify view location and extension. Will identify view location and extension. View location and extension, because controller returned just name of the view. The controller also don't know what is the view technology. It is just returned the data and it returned the name of the file. But where is that file? What is the extension of that file? Those details will be identified by view resolver. So sixth step, dispatcher servlet will send view name to the view resolver. View resolver will identify view location and extension, will location and extension, and sends data to dispatcher servlet. Sends data to dispatcher servlet. That is the seventh step. Observe. Seventh step. So it identified the view location and it sent that location details and extension details to dispatcher servlet. Now, what is the eighth step? Dispatcher servlet will give model data and view details to view component. Details to view component. It will just send the model data and view location details to the view component. Model data and view location to view component. Right. Now, what is the ninth step? What is the ninth step? Whatever the data it is there, it has to render that data. It has to display that data on that view file. Right. Model data will be rendered on view and sends back to dispatcher servlet and sends back to dispatcher servlet in the ninth step. So model data will be rendered on that view and sends that back to dispatcher servlet. Now what is the 10th step? What is the 10th step? Dispatcher servlet will convert and send response to user. Whoever send that request will send the response back to browser or user. Send response back for the request, for the received request. Whatever the request it is received, right? For that request it is going to send the response back. So this is called request execution flow in the Spring MVC. Request execution flow in Spring MVC application. Incoming HTTP request will be received by dispatcher servlet. So look at this diagram step by step. Numbering also I have given to understand very clearly. Right? So whenever we talk about Spring MVC, first you need to understand these components. What are those components? Dispatcher servlet, handler mapper, controller, view resolver, view component. What is the role of the dispatcher servlet? It is acting as a front controller responsible to perform pre-processing and post-processing. Performing pre-processing and post-processing. What is the role of the handler mapper? Handler mapper is responsible to identify which controller should process this request. Responsible to identify which controller should process this request. Then what is controller? Controller is a program which is used to handle the request. Request handling logic will be available in the controller, which is responsible to handle the controller. Then what is a view resolver? View resolver is responsible to identify where the view files are available. It is responsible to identify where the view files are available. Then what is view component? View component is responsible to render model data on the view file. It is responsible to render model data on the view file. Are you able to follow this? Now, let's understand once again from start to end how a request will be processed. Come on. First, whenever we send a HTTP request, that request will be received by dispatcher servlet. Dispatcher servlet is a predefined servlet program. It is going to act as a front controller in our Spring MVC application. Right. When the request is received by the dispatcher servlet will send the request details to the handler mapper. Will send the details to the handler mapper. Handler mapper will identify who is request handler, which is responsible to handle this request. That information will be identified by the handler mapper, will send that information back to the dispatcher servlet. That is the third step. Right. Now, once the dispatcher servlet got the information about the controller, at the fourth step, dispatcher servlet will go to that controller and will call that controller method. Right. Now, controller will process that request, will send the response back to the dispatcher servlet in the form of model and view object. Model means data, which is used to store the data. View means logical file name. View means logical file name. So model and view object will be returned by the controller to the dispatcher servlet. Who is calling controller method? Dispatcher servlet will call the controller method. So to whom controller will send the data? To the dispatcher servlet. What data? Model and view. Model means data. View means logical file name. View means logical file name. Right. Now, once the data sent to the dispatcher servlet, dispatcher knows the data model object, but it knows only logical view name. Where is that view file? What is the view technology? Those details are abstraction to the dispatcher servlet. It doesn't know where the view file is available. It doesn't know what is the view file. For that, at the sixth step, dispatcher servlet will talk to view resolver. Dispatcher servlet is going to talk to view resolver. So there are several view resolvers are available in the Spring MVC. Several view resolvers are available which are used to resolve the view locations. They are responsible to identify where the view file is available and what is the extension of that view. So at the sixth step, dispatcher servlet will send view name to the view resolver. It will send view name to the view resolver. At the seventh step, view resolver will identify where is that file, what is the extension of that file. Is it a JSP or is it a timely? And in which folder that file is available. Those information will be that information will be identified by view resolver and will send that information back to the dispatcher servlet. Location of the file, extension of the file will be identified by view resolver, will give the data back to dispatcher servlet. Then what the dispatch servlet will do at the eighth step? With the model data and with the view detail, it will talk to view. It will talk to view component. What is the beauty of the view component? It will render that model data on the view component and will send that back to the dispatcher servlet at the ninth step. At the ninth step, right? Once dispatcher servlet got the details from the view component, it will do necessary conversions and will send that response back to the received request in the form of HTTP response. So that is the 10th step and that is the last step. So once the 10th step is completed, we can say request processing is completed by our application. So from 1 to 10, the request execution flow is going to happen. So these all components are going to be involved when the request is received by our application. These are all our predefined components that are available in our Spring MVC module. So I hope you understood what is Spring MVC, why Spring MVC, what are the advantages of the Spring MVC and the architecture of the Spring MVC, the components of the Spring MVC and the request execution process in the Spring MVC. I hope it is clear for everybody. Guys, please like this video. If you like this explanation, please like this video in the YouTube. People who are watching in the YouTube, like this video. Fine. So with this, we understood what is the architecture of the Spring MVC, and we prepared a notes also. I will share this notes location. I can upload to the Facebook group also. Our Facebook group name, Tech Leads. FB group name, Tech Leads. This diagram and this notes, whatever I have written in the notepad, I will upload this to Tech Leads. If you are not subscribed, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Wherever you are watching this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. My YouTube channel is Ashok IT. Please subscribe to this channel. FB group name is Tech Leads and YouTube channel Ashok IT. Thank you all of you. See you in the next session.